Perhaps many of you have already heard the name Hinterkaifeck. It was on the Hinterkaifeck farm in Germany that the bodies of an entire family and their maid were discovered in April of 1922. Police investigations quickly pointed to the possibility of more than one murderer, who had reportedly lived on the farm for several days after committing the crime. However, it is not these facts that make the massacre so mysterious, but rather what was happening on the farm in the days leading up to the tragedy. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Alcione Posamai, and welcome to another frightening episode of Lost Bones. Today, we will delve into the sinister case of the Hinterkaifeck murders and the many theories surrounding this event. The Hinterkaifeck farm was built in 1863, approximately 50 years before the murders. By the late 19th century, the Gruber family, consisting of Andreas, his wife Casilia, and their daughter Victoria, lived on the property. Over time, the family grew with the arrival of the Gruber two grandchildren, Joseph and Casilia. By November of 1920, the family also employed a maid named Crescens Rieger. Although they appeared to be an ordinary German family of the 20th century, it was well known among the locals that the Grubers were rather peculiar. In fact, they were not respected by most of their neighbors. The reason lay in the grotesque and scandalous reputation they had acquired. It all began in December of 1914, when Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, was reported dead during a bombing in France while serving in the First World War. His body was never returned to his family, but his absence did not seem to be much of an issue. After all, by 1915, the family patriarch, Andreas, and his widowed daughter, Victoria, who was in her early 30s, were accused of incest. According to sources, this incestuous relationship allegedly led to the birth of Joseph Gruber. As a result, Andreas was sentenced to 1 year in prison, while Victoria received a 1-month sentence. Following these events, the family became more reclusive. The only members occasionally seen in town were Victoria and her eldest daughter, Casilia. In November of 1921, the maid Crescens Rieger resigned after telling Andreas that his house was haunted. According to her, every night around midnight, strange sounds could be heard coming from the attic. Before leaving the farm, however, Andreas decided to investigate the noises himself. Yet, he found nothing unusual. The story spread among the neighbors, who offered their help, but Andreas declined and the matter was never reported to the local police. Later, one of young Casilia's friends would recount that the girl had told her about her mother, Victoria, fleeing the farm during the night after a family argument. She was only found hours later, deep in the nearby forest, specifically in the area known as Witch's Grove. This incident suggested that something strange was indeed happening on the property. After the maid's resignation, Andreas remained skeptical about her claims. However, in the early months of 1922, he began telling neighbors that he, too, was hearing noises, this time coming from the basement. Additionally, in the early March of 1922, Andreas discovered a newspaper on his property. Strangely, that newspaper should never have been there, as it was an ordinary publication from Munich, a city located 80 kilometers from the farm. The situation grew even stranger later that March, when a severe snowstorm struck the region. On one of the following mornings, Andreas noticed several footprints around the property, all leading towards the Witch's Grove. The footprints also revealed a pattern suggesting that someone had entered and taken shelter for some time in the machine room, where the lock was broken and the door was always left open. In the following months, Andreas repeatedly asked his neighbors if they were experiencing similar events. However, it seemed that no one else was dealing with such occurrences. After that, his wife, daughter, and grandchildren began reporting that the farm's keys were disappearing from their usual places. Things took a darker turn when they claimed to have seen a mustached stranger wandering near the farm. As a result, Andreas told his neighbors that his family was becoming paranoid because of these events. However, the truth was that 7-year-old Gazilia was frequently seen falling asleep in class, having spent sleepless nights with her mother, Victoria, who seemed terrified that someone might break into the farm during the night. Despite the strange happenings, Andreas decided to hire a new maid, 44-year-old Maria Baumgartner. On March 31st, 1922, the new maid arrived at the Gruber family farm, accompanied by her sister, where they met Maria's new employers. As night fell that day, Maria's sister said her goodbyes and returned home, unaware of the tragedy that was about to unfold. On the morning of April 1st, 1922, two brothers and coffee salesmen, Hans and Eduard Skirovsky, stopped by the farm to sell coffee to Gruber family, who were regular customers. However, the brothers noticed an unusual silence around the property. Out of concern, they entered to investigate, but found only the doors to the machine room visibly broken. The rest of the house was locked, so they moved on to another farm. Later that night, a craftsman named Michel Plow passed by the area and noticed smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney. He later reported seeing someone outside holding a lantern, though he could not identify who it was. Nearby, farmer and butcher Simon Ray Blunder spotted two unfamiliar men near the edge of the forest. As he approached, the men turned away and avoided him. Meanwhile, Kazilia's teachers noticed her absence from school and found it odd that it happened without any prior notice. Members of the Sunday congregation, of which the Gruber family was a part, also remarked on the family's absence from that week's service. On April 3rd, the local postman observed that Saturday's mail had not been collected, but did not stop to investigate further. The following day, Albert Hafner visited a farm to repair a motor in the machine room, as previously arranged. Upon arrival, he noticed the absence of any family members, but proceeded with his work regardless. Albert observed that the family's dog was locked inside the barn, but chose not to investigate. He stayed at the farm for 4 hours that day. When he was leaving, Albert noticed that the barn door was open, and the dog had been tied up outside. He found it strange that he had not heard or seen anyone, but even so, he returned to the town and shared his concerns about the unusual situation with Lorenz Schillenbauer, a neighbor of the Grubers. Concerned about the situation, Lorenz sent his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Josef to investigate the farm around 3:30 in the afternoon. The boys quickly returned, reporting that they had found no one on the property. Unsatisfied, Lorenz, along with two friends, Michael Pohl and Jakob Siegel, decided to investigate the farm more thoroughly a few minutes later. The first thing they noticed was the eerie silence within the residence. They decided to start with the barn, where they were met with a horrifying sight. The bodies of the entire family lay sprawled inside. Lorenz moved the bodies and realized that young Josef was not among the dead. Fearing the worst, he rushed into the house, where he found Josef's lifeless body in his crib, alongside the corpse of maid Maria. A few hours later, Inspector George Ringgruber from the Munich Police Department arrived at the crime scene. The brutality of what had transpired on the farm was immediately apparent. Before long, the farm was swarmed with neighbors and onlookers, many of whom wandered near the crime scene and even ate in the kitchen. The following day, forensic doctor Johann Baptist Müller was tasked with conducting the autopsies. The patriarch Andreas Gruber had his face crushed and died instantly. His wife Casilia was strangled before receiving 7 blows to her head from an unknown object. Victoria suffered similar injuries, but her skull was struck 2 additional times. The maid was killed by several blows resembling those made with a hoe. Little Joseph, just 2 years old, had his skull brutally crushed. The most harrowing discovery was that of the Gruber's eldest grandchildren, 7-year-old Casilia. Her skull had been shattered and her throat was slit. When her body was examined, the autopsy revealed that the little girl had torn out her own hair. This was attributed to the fact that she had survived from 4 hours after the attack, growing so desperate beside the bodies of her parents that she pulled out her hair in anguish. The absence of any signs of struggle led investigators to believe that the victims had been lured to the location one by one and then killed. All the farm animals were found well fed, and it appeared that the killers had prepared meals on the farm in the days following the murders. Initially, the nature of the Hinterkaifeck murders gave rise to supernatural speculations, but these theories were soon dismissed. One intriguing detail was that the older women had been strangled before their heads were crushed. Victoria suffered the most blows of all. The maid Maria and little Joseph were killed quickly, almost as though they were merely loose ends that needed to be eliminated. Inspector George Ringgruber was deeply disturbed by the results of the investigation. It became evident that the killers had remained in the house until the day the bodies were discovered. Not only had they lived on the property, but worse, in George's mind, one of the dozens of neighbors in the surrounding area might have been involved in the atrocity. Nonetheless, the investigators attempted to follow a standard investigative path. They initially believed that the robbery might have been the motive. As a result, craftsmen, petty thieves, vagrants, and hundreds of local residents were interrogated, but nothing suspicious emerged. This theory was ultimately dismissed when a large sum of money was found untouched within the residence. The motive for the crime soon proved to be uncertain and completely random. As a result, all the investigators could do was form their own theories and identify potential suspects for the massacre. The first suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, who had been presumed dead. Remembered how we mentioned he supposedly died during the First World War? Well, his body was, in fact, never recovered. Investigators theorized that Carl might have returned and discovered the incestuous relationship that led to Joseph's birth. This theory did not gain much traction at the time, but it resurfaced after the end of the Second World War, when German prisoners reported being freed by a Soviet officer of German origin who claimed to have committed the murders. The testimony of these prisoners gained credibility when the Carl's friend revealed that, before his supposed death, he had expressed a desire to move to Russia. Today, however, this theory is largely dismissed due to its implausibility and the minimal likelihood of such events occurring. As the list of suspects grew, something strange happened in May of 1927. Around midnight, an unknown man shouted to a local resident that he had committed the murders. He then ran into the nearby forest. The suspect was extensively sought, but was never identified. As a result, investigators began to suspect Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the man who had discovered the bodies. Lawrence's story was intriguing. He had lost his wife around 1918, and then were rumors that he had been romantically involved with Victoria Gruber. Lawrence became a suspect after friends reported that, upon discovering the bodies, he immediately ran into the house, even though the doors had been locked until that moment. During questioning, Lawrence also displayed an unusual concern regarding Josef's whereabouts, as the child might have been the result of his relationship with Victoria. Suspicions surrounding Lawrence persisted, especially after reports emerged that he had mentioned details about the case that neither the newspapers nor the police had disclosed to the public. The situation grew even stranger in 1923, when the farmhouse was demolished. New evidence was discovered, including a pocket knife found among the hay and a hoe located in the attic of the residence. According to the case files, a witness named Hans Jeblager claimed to have seen Lawrence wandering over the ruins of the house. When questioned, Lawrence reported that he was investigating and suggested that the murderer had not buried the bodies due to the frozen ground on the farm at the time of the crime. This point caught the attention of investigators, as it indicated that Lawrence seemed to have detailed knowledge of the soil conditions at the time of the massacre. One line of investigation suggested that shortly before the murders, Victoria had reached out to Lawrence, seeking his support in raising young Josef. Lawrence passed away in 1941, but not before earning a substantial amount of money from defamation lawsuits against those who labeled him the Hinterkaifeck killer. After his death, new suspects emerged. According to Crescencia Meyer, her two brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump, had allegedly confessed to committing the murders. However, Adolf had already passed away by the time. Anton was detained and charged but eventually released due to the lack of evidence. Another key witness for the police was the family's former maid, Crescens Rieger, who claimed that two former farm workers, Anton and Karl Bichler, might have been involved. She also revealed that another former employee, George Siegel, might have joined forces with others to kill the family and steal their fortune. In November of 1920, George had allegedly robbed the property but denied the accusations. Crescens Rieger also suggested that Josef Thaler could have been involved in the crime. She reported that Josef frequently approached her, asking various questions about the Gruber family, which she deliberately avoided answering. In 1971, authorities gained access to a written letter by a woman named Therese T. The letter was a recollection of an event that supposedly occurred when she was 12 years old. According to Therese, one day her mother was visited by the mother of two brothers, Carl and Andreas S. This woman allegedly confessed that her sons had committed the murders and had lost their pocket knife at the crime scene. The issue, however, was that the Gruber's former maid, Crescens Rieger, had informed authorities that she had already seen the pocket knife on the property before her resignation. Two other intriguing suspects were Peter Weber and Josef Betz. Both were friends and had worked together on the farm around 1920. According to Josef, Peter had once spoken about an isolated farm called Hinterkaifeck, where an incestuous elderly couple lived. During questioning, Josef claimed that Peter had expressed a willingness to kill the family's children to gain their fortune. However, Josef denied agreeing to help him commit the act. After that conversation, they never discussed the possibility again. Following this line of thought, there is the theory involving a phantom serial killer nicknamed Paul Miller, who is suspected of massacring a family in Massachusetts in 1897. This criminal was identified after writer Bill James studied more than 40 murders across the United States that followed a similar pattern. According to the writer, the serial killer was a German immigrant who targeted isolated residences and slaughtered the inhabitants using a farming tool. Bill suggests that Paul Miller was responsible for the murders at Hinterkaifeck, theorizing that he might have started his crimes in his homeland before moving to the United States. However, this theory is not widely credited due to the lack of concrete evidence supporting the existence of such a criminal. Over the year, more than 100 suspects have been named in the Hinterkaifeck massacre case, but many believe that Lawrence remained the primary and most likely suspect. Yet, as mentioned earlier, Lawrence maintained his innocence until the day he died. The case was officially closed in 1955, but returned to public attention in 2007, when 15 cadets from the Fürstenfeldbruck Police Academy in Germany reopened the case and conducted an investigation. Using modern techniques, they reportedly identified a suspect for the crime. However, the name of the suspect was kept confidential, out of respect for their descendants. It is worth noting that this investigation revealed that the police of the time had meticulously recorded and studied many pieces of evidence. However, investigators criticized the failure to collect fingerprints at the crime scene, a method already in use at the time, but strangely not applied in this case. This case has now surpassed 100 years, and it seems almost impossible to believe it will ever be solved. Nevertheless, it continues to be studied by the German police department, which remains committed to reviewing cold cases. Records indicate that even in 1999, a witness approached the police claiming that their former landlord had confessed to personally meeting the perpetrators of the Hinterkaifeck massacre around 1935. However, the police did not pursue this testimony, as all individuals involved in the story were already deceased. Thus, as far as we know, the Hinterkaifeck murder remains an unsolved mystery, one in which the lives of 6 people were brutally taken without a shred of mercy.